From a distance, a Russian mechanized column moving along a road in southern Donetsk can look like a serious problem. Tanks at the front, providing the weight and the shock value. BMP infantry carriers behind them holding the troops that will take and hold whatever the armor breaks through. Artillery working the ground ahead to cut communications, suppress defensive positions, and create the psychological pressure that makes a line feel like it is about to give. On paper, it is a formation built to do exactly what it intends to do: break through, exploit, and advance. Along the Vuhledar to Marinka corridor, a Russian mechanized force attempted exactly that kind of push, following days of sustained artillery preparation with a coordinated armored assault intended to crack Ukraine's defensive position in southern Donetsk. What the column commanders did not know was that the road they were moving down had already been chosen, not by them, by Ukraine. If you want this kind of detailed tactical and operational analysis on every major engagement in this war, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Understanding how these engagements actually work is the only way to understand what they mean. The Russian approach in southern Donetsk has a recognizable shape, and that recognizability is part of what makes it vulnerable. The sequence works like this. Concentrate artillery on Ukrainian forward positions for several days, generating enough pressure to disrupt communications between defensive groups, force troops to keep their heads down, and create observable gaps in Ukrainian movement near the front. Once that pressure appears to have softened the line sufficiently, push armor forward along a primary axis before Ukraine can reconstitute. Convert firepower into ground control. The logic is coherent, and it has worked in other conditions. In open terrain, against an opponent without adequate anti-tank coverage or aerial surveillance, an armored push supported by prior artillery preparation can break a defensive line before the defender has time to respond. The attacker is counting on the transition from suppression to exploitation happening faster than the defender can organize a coherent response. But the Vuhledar to Marinka corridor is not open terrain. This area of southern Donetsk is shaped by the features that determine who sees first and who fires first, rather than who has more mass. Road networks constrain where heavy vehicles can move. Tree lines and elevated ground control observation. The edges of small settlements provide concealed positions for anti-tank teams. A narrow route that channels a column forward also channels it into every weapon system positioned along it. And the history of this specific area, where earlier Russian armored pushes had already produced some of the most visible vehicle destruction footage of the entire war, meant that the tactical lessons of this terrain were not theoretical for anyone paying attention. Those lessons, apparently, had not changed Russian assault doctrine in this sector. The column came down the same kind of axis. It used the same basic structure. It relied on the same sequential logic of artillery, followed by armor, followed by infantry carriers. Ukraine had studied that pattern, and it had built the response. The T-72B3 tanks at the front of the column bring genuine capabilities to an assault. The main gun is powerful enough to defeat most obstacles at direct fire range. The frontal armor, when properly angled and on flat terrain, provides meaningful protection against many threats. The psychological effect of a functioning tank advancing on a defensive position is real and should not be minimized. The T-72B3 is not a negligible weapon system. The BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles behind them add a different layer. Faster and more mobile than the tanks, they carry dismountable infantry while contributing cannon fire and anti-tank guided missiles to the assault. In combination with the T-72s, they create the two complementary elements of a mechanized push: breakthrough capability from the front, exploitation capability from behind. In the terrain of the Vuhledar corridor, both of these advantages come with conditions attached. A tank is most dangerous when it is moving, when it has room to maneuver, when its crew has adequate observation of the threat environment, and when the terrain gives it options for cover and concealment. A road through broken agricultural ground and settlement outskirts provides none of these conditions reliably. The tank is channeled. Its movement is predictable. Its flanks are exposed to the vegetation and damaged structures that line the corridor. Its crew's observation is constrained by the very features that make dismounted infantry valuable in this kind of terrain. A BMP-3 shares these constraints and adds one more. Once stopped, whether by damage, by a blocked vehicle ahead, or by the crew's uncertainty about what is happening forward, it traps the infantry it is carrying. The soldiers inside are protected only as long as the vehicle is mobile and intact. If the vehicle stops under fire, dismounting means exposing personnel to a combat environment that the column was supposed to give them an approach through, not deliver them into. Ukraine understood all of this before the column moved. The engagement was not a reaction to an assault. It was a prepared response to a predictable approach. The most important detail of how this ambush was constructed is not the weapons that were used. It is what Ukraine chose not to do at the opening of the engagement. Ukrainian forces did not contest every forward position at maximum intensity. During the preceding days of Russian artillery preparation, they left observable gaps, forward positions that appeared quiet or lightly defended, ground that could be read by an attacker as softening under pressure, as evidence that the days of shelling were working and that a push now would find a line ready to give. This was deliberate. The gap was not weakness, it was the entrance to the trap. Ukraine was shaping where the fight would happen rather than fighting the battle at the time and place that suited Russia's approach. Behind the apparent weakness, the actual defensive architecture was being positioned. Bradley M2A2 fighting vehicles were placed where their 25mm Bushmaster cannons had flanking angles on the road, capable of engaging the sides of vehicles moving along the corridor, where armor is thinner and optics and drive systems are more exposed. Javelin anti-tank teams were positioned with clean lines of sight to the expected approach path. Reconnaissance drones were already in the air over the route, feeding real-time imagery back to the ground crews. Infantry units held positions that could close off escape routes and engage dismounted troops if the armor was stopped. The design was not a collection of independent weapons, each waiting for a target. It was a layered system, where each element was assigned a specific function within a coordinated response. Time to activate, after the column had moved far enough into the corridor to lose its freedom of movement. Freedom of movement is the key variable. A column on a road can advance or retreat, but it cannot spread out. It cannot disperse rapidly. It cannot take the lateral movement that would give individual vehicles cover from a flanking threat. Once a column is deep enough into a corridor that reversing requires threading through all the vehicles behind it, the options available to individual crews narrow dramatically. Ukraine was not trying to stop the column at its outer edge. It was pulling the column to the point where stopping it would maximize the damage to the entire formation rather than just the lead elements. The silence that the Russian assault commanders may have interpreted as a sign of Ukrainian retreat was the trap being patient. The problem of vehicle spacing within a column under pressure is one that doctrine addresses but psychology undermines. Standard mechanized doctrine specifies intervals between vehicles that prevent a single hit from affecting adjacent platforms. The interval creates time and space for following crews to observe what happens to the vehicle ahead and respond, whether by stopping, maneuvering, or engaging the threat before it reaches them. Under pressure, those intervals compress. Crews follow the vehicle ahead instinctively. They avoid moving off the road surface because the margins are either soft ground that risks immobility or terrain features that might conceal mines. They stay on the visible path because the visible path is where control feels possible. The result is that a column under pressure tends to close its gaps precisely when maintaining them matters most. From above, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones were tracking this compression in real time. They were not just identifying that vehicles were present, they were reading the column's internal structure, which vehicle was leading, where command vehicles were likely positioned, where gaps were smallest, which section of the formation had committed too deeply to reverse without blocking vehicles behind it. That information translated directly into target prioritization. The lead tanks mattered most for initial engagement, because stopping them stops everything behind them. The infantry carriers mattered, because destroying them before the infantry can dismount in organized fashion prevents the assault from transitioning to the dismounted phase, where surviving troops might still achieve tactical objectives on foot. And timing mattered more than anything else. A strike triggered too early allows rear vehicles to observe, reverse, and disperse before they are fully inside the fire zone. A strike triggered after the column has extended into the prepared engagement area means that every vehicle's options have already been constrained by terrain, spacing, and momentum. Ukraine waited for the column to be where Ukraine wanted it before the first round was fired. When the engagement began, it opened on two simultaneous axes. Javelin teams engaged the T-72B3 tanks at the front of the column. The Javelin is a fire-and-forget system. Once the operator locks the seeker onto the target's thermal signature and initiates the shot, no further operator input is required. The missile guides autonomously to the designated point, which in top attack mode means it climbs after launch and approaches the target from above, striking the upper surface of the vehicle rather than its frontal plate. This matters because the armor geometry of a T-72B3 is not uniform. The frontal plate and turret front are the most heavily protected surfaces, designed to defeat direct fire threats at combat ranges. The upper surfaces, the roof of the turret, the engine deck, the rear plate, are substantially thinner. A missile arriving from above at a steep descent angle is engaging the weakest section of the vehicle's protection. When a Javelin penetrating warhead reaches the interior of a T-72B3, it encounters a second problem that is specific to how Russian tank ammunition storage was designed. Soviet and Russian tank doctrine accepted the risk of storing propellant charges inside the fighting compartment in exchange for a smaller crew requirement and a faster autoloader. When a penetrating strike reaches those stored charges, the result is not a contained equipment failure. The propellant initiates catastrophically. The crew compartment becomes the origin point of an internal explosion that the turret ring cannot contain. The turret separates from the hull under the overpressure, and what was a combat vehicle becomes a reference point for where the road is no longer usable. For the vehicles behind the first tank, this is not just a blocked road. It is information delivered at maximum psychological intensity about what the road ahead means for them. While the Javelin teams were working the T-72s, the Bradley fighting vehicles were engaging the BMP-3 carriers from the flanking positions Ukraine had established before the column moved. The M2A2 Bushmaster cannon fires 25mm rounds at a cyclic rate that allows the gunner to put multiple rounds on target within a single engagement without repositioning. Against a BMP-3, the 25mm round is not a guaranteed one-shot kill on the vehicle's primary systems, but that is not what the Bushmaster is optimized to do in this engagement geometry. Firing from the side, the Bushmaster can systematically target the components that make a BMP-3 operational. The drive wheels and track systems that provide mobility, the optics and sight systems that allow the crew to observe and engage, the engine compartment that provides propulsion, the weapon station that gives the vehicle its direct fire capability. A BMP-3 that has lost a track cannot move. One that has lost its optics cannot fight effectively. One that is burning from an engine compartment forces its crew to decide in seconds whether to fight from a burning vehicle or dismount into the ground around it. Dismounting into the ground around a burning BMP-3 that is under observation from above is not a solution. It is a transition from one danger to a different and less sheltered one. The flanking engagement geometry was the critical advantage the Bradley positions provided. A vehicle on a road has its frontal armor pointed forward along its direction of movement. Threats arriving from the side engage the thinner lateral armor rather than the glacis plate. The BMP-3's side protection is not designed to defeat repeated 25mm impacts. The combination of the flanking angle and the Bushmaster's sustained fire rate meant that the BMP-3s were being engaged where they were most vulnerable rather than where they were strongest. The formation that was meant to deliver infantry into a breakthrough was becoming the enclosed space that trapped them. When the lead tanks were stopped and the BMP-3s were being engaged from the side, the assault's internal command structure began to break. A mechanized column functions through control. Individual vehicle commanders receive and execute orders. Unit commanders coordinate movement across multiple vehicles. The assault maintains its direction and momentum through a chain of decisions that moves from the command element to the executing crews faster than the defender can respond. When the front of the column is on fire and the carriers behind it are being struck from a direction that the assault formation was not oriented to defend, that command chain experiences simultaneous pressure at multiple points. Vehicle commanders are making survival decisions without waiting for orders, because the situation in front of them is changing faster than reporting up and waiting for direction is practical. Unit commanders are trying to understand what is happening to a formation that no longer looks like its initial configuration. The assault is no longer a spearhead. It is a sequence of individual crew problems occurring simultaneously along a road. Above all of this, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones remained in position, tracking the developing situation and feeding updates to the ground crews, coordinating the engagement. Every vehicle that stopped, every crew that dismounted, every group of soldiers moving toward cover in the terrain adjacent to the road, bomb-dropping drones, smaller systems carrying explosive charges, transitioned to the dismounted infantry as the armored engagement phase developed. Their role was not to defeat armor. It was to prevent the soldiers who had survived the initial strike from regrouping into a coherent force. An infantry team that is under drone observation and being periodically struck by explosive charges cannot concentrate, cannot aid wounded, cannot organize a defensive perimeter, and cannot return to the vehicles to recover equipment. The soldiers are forced to keep moving. Moving soldiers under drone observation are trackable. Trackable soldiers remain under pressure. The assault's human component, which was supposed to follow the armor into a breach, is instead dispersed across terrain that the defender's aerial surveillance network is already mapping. One T-72B3 in this engagement was reportedly abandoned by its crew in functional condition after the operators watched several adjacent vehicles destroyed in rapid succession. The tank retained its gun, its ammunition, its radios, its navigation equipment, and whatever operational materials were inside the crew compartment when the crew dismounted and moved away from it. A captured functioning tank carries intelligence value that a destroyed one does not. Radios can reveal frequencies and communication protocols. Navigation systems can contain stored waypoints and routes. Maintenance records and manuals describe the technical specifications of the equipment and the procedures the unit follows to operate it. A lost tank is expensive in material terms. A captured one is expensive in material terms and potentially more expensive in intelligence terms, depending on what the crew left inside it. The ambush along the Vuhledar to Marinka corridor was not designed to end when the last vehicle stopped moving. It was designed to collapse the assault as a functioning system, not just to destroy equipment, but to prevent the human elements from reconstituting into anything that could continue the mission. The tactical picture from this engagement points toward a broader truth about how armored warfare is being conducted in this phase of the conflict. The T-72B3 is not an inadequate tank by historical standards. The BMP-3 is not an inadequate infantry fighting vehicle. Neither platform has become irrelevant. They are still capable of generating the effects they were designed to produce under conditions that allow them to operate at their strengths: reasonable maneuver room, adequate drone defense overhead, flexible command authority, and intelligence about what is waiting on the route ahead. What they cannot do is operate effectively in a zone where the defender has already established aerial observation of every approach route, positioned anti-tank weapons at angles that address the vehicle's weakest armor surfaces, and constructed an engagement sequence that is triggered after the attacking formation has moved past the point where rapid extraction is feasible. Ukraine's response to the assault was not a single powerful weapon. It was a connected system operating faster than the column's internal decision-making cycle. The reconnaissance drones established the picture. The Javelin teams addressed the armored breakthrough element. The Bradleys addressed the infantry carriers from the flank. The bomb-dropping drones addressed the dismounted survivors. The ground infantry held the positions that prevented the assault from finding an alternative axis after the primary route was blocked. Each component created conditions that made the next component more effective. Stopping the lead tanks slowed the column and compressed the spacing. Compressed spacing gave the Bradleys multiple targets within their effective range simultaneously. Stopped and burning carriers forced infantry into open ground. Infantry in open ground became targets for drone systems that had been observing the route throughout the engagement. The ambush was not a trap that snapped shut at one moment. It was a sequence that closed progressively as the column moved deeper into it, with each layer removing another option from the attacker's available responses. The strategic implication of what happened along this corridor extends beyond the specific vehicles and personnel involved. Russia has been conducting variants of this assault pattern, sustained artillery, followed by armored push along a primary axis, throughout its operations in Donetsk. The pattern reflects genuine doctrine, and it has produced results in some sectors. But the preconditions for that pattern to succeed are increasingly difficult to establish against an opponent that has integrated aerial surveillance, precision anti-tank weapons, and armored fighting vehicles into a combined system specifically designed to defeat it. When the approach is predictable enough to be anticipated, the terrain is constrained enough to channel the column, and the defender has the reconnaissance assets to watch the formation develop in real time, the classical advantages of mass and armor begin to work against the attacker rather than for it. Future Russian operations in this sector will require solutions to problems this engagement made visible: adequate counter-drone coverage over the advance, faster command decision-making that can recognize an ambush before the column is fully committed, and either different approach geometries that reduce the channeling effect of road-bound movement, or deliberate dispersion that trades column coherence for reduced vulnerability to the layered ambush structure Ukraine has developed. The contest in southern Donetsk is no longer primarily about which side has more tanks in its supply inventory. It is about which side can see the battlefield more clearly, connect that observation to its weapons systems more quickly, and make decisions that are faster and more accurate than the opponent's ability to respond. Ukraine demonstrated along the Vuhledar to Marinka corridor that the side with better sensors, better integration between those sensors and its weapons, and a more patient willingness to let the opponent commit fully before responding, does not need to match the attacker's mass to defeat the attack. It needs to choose the ground. It needs to watch the approach. And it needs to wait until every exit has already been closed before opening the engagement. The column that entered that corridor was looking for a crack in Ukraine's line. It found the bottom of a box. Stay with this channel. The evolution of mechanized combat in this conflict is producing tactical lessons that are reshaping how modern armies think about armored operations, and there is considerably more to cover.